worlds in space are as countless as all the grains of sand on all the beaches of the earth. Each of those worlds is as real as ours. In every one of them, there's a succession of incidents, events, occurrences, which influence its future. Countless worlds, numberless moments, an immensity of space and time. Using our compassion and our intelligence, our technology and our wealth to make an abundant and meaningful life for every inhabitant of this planet, to enhance enormously our understanding of the universe and to carry us to the stars.
And we're live.
Yeah. Welcome to Wild Die Harder, Hollerween edition. Look at that. Look at that smokestack there in the back. How nice is that?
Gary did a good job.
Yeah, that's from Gary. Yeah, speaking of Gary, one of the co-hosts, Gary McCallum, also known as the Murder Hobo from the Murder Hobo Show, did a lot of riff stuff and ICRPG, but still a little bit Savage World since he's been on the show for 4 or 5 years now. And the other co-host, Carl Kiesler, I mean, graphic designer, prop maker, official Pinnacle Entertainment Group demo guy, did layout for them, famous guy. Everybody knows Carl, so
if they don't, they should.
Yeah, they should.
You guys.
And then our special guest tonight, I asked John Goff to come on the show and talk all things Deadlands and more, maybe. Who knows? How's it going, John?
Not bad. Thanks for having me, guys.
My pleasure. Anyways.
It's great having you, man.
We like having famous people on the show, so that works.
Famous.
Especially famous people from my favorite setting, Deadlands.
Yep. Yeah, I just finished running For Whom the Whistle Blows, which is nice.
Nice.
Too,
yeah.
not long ago. So
how did that one end again, Eric?
Talking about.
TPK at the end. Yeah. And
That's
then
all I can ask for.
three more character deaths in the middle too. So that some of them were on their second character there. So.
You made my
Yeah.
Halloween.
Yeah, well, I was playing with Tommy Brunel, so you told me to go hard on him, so I did.
Did you kill him twice?
Yeah, basically. Well, I know. Last session, at the end, he just escaped. He was a coward and said, "Oh, screw this, I'm out," and just
Brunel!
swam away in that river, that underground river in there. So, yeah.
Gotcha.
So in case you don't know who we are, we're the Wild Eye Podcast. Wild Eye Harder is our spin-off where we get on Twitch and we have a little bit more time to talk about certain topics and have guests, things like that, because we usually record our podcast that we've been running for 5 years now. We're like over 150, 160 episodes. We cover everything Savage Worlds related. Longest running right now with the Savage Cast, but these guys are chomp. They don't put out a whole lot of content, so.
Oh, those are fighting
Man.
words,
Because I know Landauer is watching, so
right?
that's why I'm doing
that.
Him and that Chris Fox
So-
guy telling you they need to get it together.
Yeah.
Come on, guys.
So, before we get into asking John some questions, I just wanted to plug a couple of things here because it's Hollerween, a special event for Pinnacle to promote, of course, their newest upcoming setting, Holler, that we talked about in the show before. Tim Early, great writer. So if you want to know what's going on with Holler, I think, well, Chris is going to help me if he's on there. He's going to post some links and stuff. But if you go on tabletop events, Hollerween, you're going to find all the live streams, game schedules. I'm pretty sure there's still some spots left, like 50 some events. Bad news, I think Kiesler is all booked up. So
Yeah.
you missed your chance there, but there's still I think there's another Q&A with Peg tomorrow morning, Saturday, 1 p.m. Mountain Time. Holler Q&A Sunday, 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And yeah, like I said, bunch of games that you can watch. Some of them live streamed. Some of them you can only join, but yeah, so far so good. I've been watching the other shows, the other streams, and seems to be going pretty well. And stick around. We're gonna have prizes for you guys, some peg coupons to hand out at the end of the show, and we'll tell you how you can get those at that point. So yeah, I mean, let's get going. One question that's been nagging at me, and yeah, questions, if people watching, if you have questions, post them in there. We're not monitoring the crowdcast thing. We're only on Twitch, so sorry about that. It's a bit too much for us old guys to keep track of everything like that. We can barely hold this whole stream together. So yeah, one question that's been nagging at me, John, is how far back does your involvement with Deadlands go?
Oh, goodness. I want to say end of 96, early 97. Not long after it got rolling. I had just gotten out of the military, and I looked Shane up to see if he was still in the area because I'd been kind of isolated. And he said, "Oh, hey, I'm glad you got in touch. I just published this game, and I remember the games we used to have back in college, and I'd like you to maybe write for it." And but he said, but I've got a partner. So you got to go through the whole process just like anybody else. And he said, so do some web content. Then if we like that, we'll move on and maybe let you do a dime novel. If you're not familiar with the dime novels, they were little smaller
Novella
products.
kind of, and then an adventure, right?
Yeah, they had a short story, and then they had the idea was you have an adventure and then you have a short story based around the adventure. And so for my first one, I went to him and said, hey, I'm looking through the book and you guys don't have any vampires in this horror setting. And this was back when Vampire the Masquerade was really big, and there was a particular, I don't know if the word stereotype or trope tied to vampires. And he said, yeah, it just doesn't really fit with the setting. And I said, I've got an idea. And so I wrote it up. I turned it in, and at the time, Shane told me later, he said I showed it to one of his partners, Matt Forbeck, and Matt said, there are 30 of these things on the train or whatever. He said, it's going to kill everybody. And Shane said, yeah, let's go with it.
Yeah, big spoiler. Spoiler, they don't
Whoops.
Glitter in there.
Whoops.
These nose ferrets don't glitter.
No.
So the funny thing is, I think, what now, 23, 24 years later, that's probably still the thing I'm best known for. But after that, I helped them a little, I did some review of, I want to say, the Book of the Dead, maybe, and gave some feedback on that. And then they sent me Hucksters and Hexes. I think from there I went to Fire and Brimstone. I did a bunch of smaller pieces in the interim, like an adventure for Lost Angels. I did the Metal Mages for City of Gloom. And then for a short while, I ran it as the brand manager. And then everybody's lives kind of parted. I went off to work as a private investigator, which is a story in and of itself. But and then I still kept in touch. I still wrote little stuff. That's why I have editors.
You're a writer.
You guys aren't paying me by word, so what you can. I got back seriously involved in, I want to say 2006, 2007, as the Deadlands MMO was trying to coalesce. And that's when I wrote Deluge, which was supposed to be a transition book from the RPG to kind of fill everybody in for the MMO. And I think Matt Cutter picked up about that time. And then since then, I've basically enjoyed the most favored freelancer position with him. And it's kind of led to me stumbling into a few lines. So.
And that novel was well, there's like a bit of feedback there. The inspiration behind The Flood, Deluge?
No, it was actually, The Flood was in production at the time. And
okay.
when it came out, they wanted something that would provide the transition piece between The Flood and what the idea for the MMO was. And
Gotcha.
so what I did was I took The Flood and tried to write kind of one party's trip through it and set up the various pieces, the transition from, or at least allude to the transition from Dixie Rails and Union Blue to Empire Rails and Lone Star. So
Nice. Cool. Well, that's pretty comprehensive there. So basically from the start, or almost.
Little, I mean, I can't claim any credit for it. I came in a little later in it after Shane had done all the heavy lifting. And then he let me play in his sandbox. So
That's very cool, and it's become, one of the most famous horror franchise in RPG history
he did a
industry.
good thing with it, I think. Very
Yeah.
unique setting at the time.
Back in, I think it was April, right before the latest Deadlands Kickstarter, Shane came on the show to talk about it, and he told us the kind of, well, the feel or uh, themes he like when he runs Deadlands, and he said that it was a bit more action oriented
Right.
than pure horror, especially for one shots anyway at conventions. What about you? Do you go more spaghetti western, or you go pure horror or slasher? What's your favorite flavor?
I kind of vary between the two, especially convention games. I like to begin with the action side of things and transition into the horror aspect. Kind of set up the punch and then follow through by giving the impression you're in this Western adventure. There's some steampunk elements, and then suddenly that's not what it is. My first, I don't know how you would describe it, build off of Night Train I ran at conventions for a little bit was one in which the posse was a band of outlaws robbing a bank. And they ride into town to get this big payroll that's supposed to be there, and they find that it's overrun with vampires. So it starts off looking like your typical Western story, in this case, The Wild Bunch, and then suddenly it goes off the rails into horror. I think Deadlands really wants to have that action element. Now, in Deadlands Noir, I like to start it off as more of a typical noir detective story that slowly descends into the horrific. And I would say Hell on Earth for me is almost always action oriented, with elements of horror thrown in, but due to the nature of what you're playing in, it's going to be very, I hate to keep saying action oriented, but I can't think of a good synonym for it. Very action oriented from the start, and it's going to kind of stay that way. And Lost Colony to me, is easier to do horror in, just because of the very alien nature of the setting.
And
So,
being stranded and things
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, it's easy to build the isolated, claustrophobic feeling on all levels, whether you're on Banshee itself or you're out in the dark.
So you started with Deadlands Classic and then moved on to Reloaded, and now obviously the Weird West. Do you feel that the systems changed the way you run it or the flavor of it?
I do think Savage Worlds is more action oriented than the original Deadlands rules were. And I think in a positive way. The original Deadlands rules were, if you guys have played it, which I'm sure some of you have,
Yeah.
they were fairly crunchy and in their own way, they had the aspect that Savage Worlds had, that you never know when that one hit is going to put you down. So you've got to worry about that. But combats in Deadlands were a little more involved than they are in Savage Worlds. So it facilitates a more action-oriented running of the game. So,
Yeah, it makes sense.
I mean, we had wind in Deadlands, which made it relatively easy to knock out the mooks. or extras. But I think they really streamlined that process when you moved into Savage Worlds. So it becomes easier to have the backdrop opponents, so to speak.
Oh, it makes sense. I used to play Rollmaster, and combats were so long that we didn't have
I used to
that
love
many.
to read the crit tables on Rollmaster.
I got a question for John.
Yeah.
When you do run convention games for Deadlands, the Weird West, do you have like a one adventure you like to run over and over again, or do you have like varied adventures, like you have many adventures from your repertoire to pull from, or do you write something new every time, or how's that going?
It's a good question, and I have a good answer for it, at least a complete answer.
Okay.
What I tend to do is, if it's a convention I've never been to, I try to find something I've already written and run at a convention that hasn't been published.
Okay.
However, due to my mercenary nature, I tend to refine my adventures that I've run in convention games, and they end up published in one shape or form in a pinnacle product, like the Explorer, for example. I was going through that and I was like, oh holy crap, there's a lot of stuff in there. Blood Drive has elements of things that I've run.
I was going to ask that because I'm a fan of Blood Drive, and I think that's a really good, like,
Well,
mini campaign, mini set, like a really small campaign that you can run for friends, and it's like three like PDFs.
Yeah,
I guess you can start. Yeah,
yeah.
and it's really cool. So I was wondering where that came from too. So that's
Coming from you, that's that actually, that's a pretty high compliment, man. But usually what I do is, there were, back when I lived in Spokane, there were a couple of conventions, or 3 conventions, that I kind of did every year.
Right.
So every year I would make sure I had a new one to run on the convention circuit. Now that I'm out here, it looks like there's a few conventions in the area that I'll probably find myself ending up at rather regularly.
Cool.
Last year, Teller and I did ChupacabraCon. That might be a little far for me to do every year in Texas.
Yeah.
But Mace is literally just down the road, so I can see showing up there frequently. As to Blood Drive, that was inspired almost completely by Lonesome Dove.
That's what I'm a Lonesome Dove fan, and I was like, this reminds me of Lonesome Dove a little bit. Okay, I understand.
I have watched that so many times, and I thought,
I've read it, I've watched it.
Such a great mini campaign.
It is. It's amazing.
In fact, all our dogs are named after characters from Lonesome Dove.
Oh, that's cool.
And we have laughed repeatedly that I'm Gus and my wife is a Woodrow. So
that's awesome. Very cool.
Nice. Deadlands Noir. So yeah, we went on the cruise, and Carl was with me in the bus. We took a tour of New Orleans and the cemetery and that stuff. And so I remember when Deadlands Noir, the Kickstarter and all that. And so was that your first spinoff that you worked on? Because I know you've worked on Lost Colony now, but I think it was someone else that worked on the original, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, you can find my name on some stuff in Hell on Earth. And originally I had a pitch for Lost Colony because I was actually, I think, technically a Pinnacle employee at the time. But I think John Hopler picked it up and ran with it. And I worked on Deadlands D20. But it's definitely the first I've made that large of a contribution to.
You were the main guy for it, right? You were the main guy. You were the main guy for that.
It was one that Shane said, pitch me Deadlands Noir. And so that one was almost entirely me. I think Shane's only direction going into it is I don't want to glorify smoking. That's a thing that he's just very passionate about, having lost a family member to lung cancer. And jokingly at the time, I said, "Oh, I had this great idea for cancer mages," and I just ran down the list. He goes, "Actually, that's pretty cool," and that's where Drifters came from. Basically, a tasteless joke.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was the one that I kind of took and ran with. So, and that actually spawned from, I want to say 2000, Virginia Tech got to play in the Sugar Bowl. And I think it was for the national championship against Florida State. And Shane, my wife, another college friend of ours, John Crocker, loaded up we rented a van, we drove down to New Orleans for the game. And we did like all the tours we could do. And I was just really taken with the city. We had a hotel on Bourbon Street, and at the end of this ghost tour, the guy leads us into the hotel we're in, and he said, "And this is one of the most haunted locations." But I was very taken by New Orleans and the whole atmosphere and the mystique. So when Deadlands Noir came up, I'm like, it has to be in New Orleans.
Perfect.
And it didn't hurt that I wrote River of Blood and kind of fell in love with that whole thing years before. But I'm like, this is the perfect place. Look at all the stuff we can do with it. So that's why it was in New Orleans and not like Chicago, which
right.
I took some grief from Ken Hite. But, everything should be in Chicago to Ken Hite.
Yeah. And of course, as you mentioned earlier on the show, you used to work as a private investigator, so that had to
still do
quite a bit.
Yeah, I took a break from it when we moved out of Richmond to Richmond, Virginia, moved to Spokane, Washington for about a decade. Good Lord, I'm old. But I did some while I was there, but now that I'm back, I'm getting all my licenses back. So I plan to be the only, I thought the only, to my knowledge, private investigator, role-playing game writer on the planet. But I met a guy that had done some private investigation as research for a book he was writing, who also did some RPG work. So he's now buried out in the woods. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, that's a very fun introduction when somebody says, "What do you do for a living?" Well,
do you have a feeling that you've got a better chance of getting away with burying that guy in the desert because you are a private investigator and you would know, like, the tips and tricks on how not to get caught?
I'm going to take the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5th on that.
All right, moving right along. It's funny that you all have these fond memories of New Orleans, because I went there one time. I don't travel much, but the one time I did go there, there's a famous restaurant outside of, it's like a breakfast place. It's called something Rose, Chicken Rose. I can't remember what it was, but anyways, we were standing outside of this thing, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, and I almost got in a fight with a homeless guy. He was spitting at me and screaming, "I got AIDS! I got AIDS!" That was my New Orleans experience, so I haven't been back. But really
it seems legitimate, right? After some of the experiences I've had there.
I told him to pick up his sleeping bag and keep on walking. But speaking of which, it's not speaking of hobos or anything like that. It's kind of a weird segue that I was shooting at there. But Halloween is tomorrow. Have you guys decided are you going to dress up? You got costumes on the go? What are you doing? No?
Going to buy one tomorrow, but I don't know what it is. Wife wanted to do Pennywise and little kid with a balloon thing, but I said maybe that's a bit too too pricey there. We'll see. We'll go Spirit of Halloween and see what we can find. Maybe, I don't know, Trump, maybe
Right.
a Trump costume in there.
I was gonna go as Bane too, man. Oh, John.
Now, I think John could get away with Bane, or that guy that plays the guitar. Didn't he have some kind of face mask in the Mad Max movie? There was a guy that had that on. I think you could get away with either
Joe?
of those.
I don't know if he had a face mask. I don't
Right.
even know if you can hear me talking to him.
Yes.
Kind of.
Maybe I need to talk like this.
There
If
you
you,
go.
if you need some, I was going to go as
Back at the beginning of the pandemic, I first got my 3D printer, and then when we got the stimulus check, I immediately bought a second one, of course, from a company in China. And my wife bought a quarter ton of dirt, and I said, I really don't feel like we're doing this right. But I looked online for various masks that you could make, and one that I found was a Bane attachment that clipped over the standard thing.
That's awesome.
So I made it, and I wore it out once and was very disappointed with the responses I got. So it hasn't left the house.
Oh, I saw one with a face hugger. That'd be bad.
Yeah.
that would be pretty cool.
People are like, "Oh, it's
would-
2020. I've seen that already."
I would have printed that up to wear for the trick-or-treaters when they come around, but one of my printers broke down, and I was in the middle of a huge printing project for Dark Ages, so I couldn't get it done. So.
I was thinking of going as a gamer because it's an easy costume. But then I realized that rather than go as a gamer, I could just go as Ron Blessing. You'll have to bear with me for a second as I explain what I'm talking about. I'm going to sort of screw up the channel here a little bit as I move this window over to see if I can't get it somewhere in where I can fix it. And here we go. There's
You
Ron.
both got the same hair.
And check it out. I'll take my thing off, and I'll move this over a little bit, and I'll just do this.
Perfect.
That's it.
You got it. That's
So I
his
figured-
picture.
Yeah.
John's looking at him like,
Right? I think I'll just go as Ron Blessing. All I need is a book of horrible dad jokes.
perfect. Hey, a question from Landauer. He's asking, what's your White Whale RPG writing project? Have one that you want to do but have not yet?
I was actually trying to type a response there, so thank you for bringing that in.
Perfect.
It would be something Shane and I have talked about for, gosh, a decade. And you'll see an occasional little adventure around it called Knight Errant, where it's a modern horror adventure that's got a very investigative tone to it. And we named it Knight Errant because that's the name of my investigative firm. So I've wanted to do it and expand on it. I have some, what I think anyway, are really cool ideas to run with, but I just never seem to find time. Either I'm distracted by stuff in the real world, or I'm trying to get something done for Pinnacle, who's pretty much all I write for now. I that way I don't have to learn any new things. So.
Yeah, I managed to pry you off of their hands for a short while there for Wise Guys, and that was a great experience there. So
that was a fun one. Thank you for asking me to work on it.
yeah, it's like, hey John, you want to do this? He's like, yeah, sure. Wow, John will write for my setting.
If you sell it to me as a one sheet or a Savage Tale, that's something I can crank out pretty quick.
Yeah.
So helpful.
Well, since the beginning of the show, you've been talking about Deadlands Dark Ages, and I mean the diehard Deadlands and Savage Worlds fans probably know what it is, but Could you pitch it a little bit, give people an idea of what it's about?
Sure. It's a Deadlands setting that takes place in 9th century England, where the players are involved just as the Reckoners start to really come into their power. If you're familiar with Deadlands, which it's one that builds off existing Deadlands lore. So without pitching the whole Deadlands lore, and I assume anyone watching The Wild Die probably has at least an inkling of what Deadlands is about. But it's in a very turbulent time in English history, which after we started discussing it and developing the setting, seems to have started to catch a lot of people's attention. So it's very timely if we can hop on the wave of Vikings, The Last Kingdom, and all the other fairly popular streaming shows that are now out there. Because it's involved in that very era, and a lot of the personalities that are making appearances in these historical dramas play major roles in Dark Ages. So
very cool. Because
That
I
sounds
know a while ago, well, I heard Shane, well, maybe it was on the cruise or another podcast, but he said that Pinnacle didn't really have a fantasy setting, or maybe it was before Lankmar anyway, but because he hasn't found anything that's really unique or something. Do you feel that Deadlands Dark Ages could be that fantasy setting that
well, I hope that it catches everybody's attention. We never set out, and we've worked very hard to make sure it's not Dungeons and Deadlands or Deadlands and Dragons. I would describe it as a very dark fantasy. I'm really pushing the horror element in it.
Cool.
People that are looking for a D&D Deadlands, this might not scratch that itch, but hopefully it gives them a mosquito bite where they didn't realize they had one, let's say.
There's often talks about settings working together with some of the companions. Is Deadlands Dark Ages going to be kind of compatible, or?
Absolutely.
The fantasy.
Shane and I are in almost constant contact over elements of Dark Ages that intersect with the companion, because we don't want to put out two conflicting products that, oh, well, here's the fantasy companion, and Deadlands Dark Ages is clearly, tying into this. Why don't these two elements work together? So it's something that we've talked about very in depth, I would say, and bounced ideas back and forth and really refined the elements where they intersect.
Nice. So you've been play testing this. I see you posting pictures with your printed terrain, and everything looks great. So how long do we have to wait for this thing?
That's a question above my pay grade. Because it's something that, if you've been following us, we announced years ago and has been in the works for a very long time. This is actually the second time that I'm running play tests with a group for Dark Ages. The first one was in three time zones to the west. But I would have to say that is really helping make it a better setting. Just the other day, we came up with a tweak to the overall concept that both Shane and I were like, wow, okay, that's far better than what we had originally planned. So, but we wanted to get out Suede. Then we had the new Deadlands edition, and I think with the companions are getting refined right now. So there are all these pieces that really, I think, need to be in place before we drop Deadlands Dark Ages. So
Nice.
it really depends on, how available the schedule is.
Yeah, because I was listening to their panel, and looks like there's going to be an ETU Kickstarter next, and then Fantasy Companion first quarter next year. So, and then Holler as well. So, hopefully next year. I'd like to see it next year.
Here's hoping. We, it seems like there's always a okay, we're going to get it this year, and then we've got all the things that come up, because it's really an adjustment figuring out what release schedule works on top of just what products need to come out beforehand. And honestly, at first, I might have had a little frustration, but now I'm actually, I think it's for the better, because it feels like every week something gets improved in Dark Ages.
Some more question. Oh, go ahead, Gary.
I was going to say the ETU that you're talking about coming out. Is that just going to be a Swade update, or is it going to be like a whole new plot point campaign?
It's a 30. No, it's a new add-on, like
one of the books.
The one for Lankmar and Iron Gate. It's going to be a book like that.
Oh,
Nice.
ETU abroad.
I like broads.
Yeah.
Study abroad.
Abroad. Yeah, study abroad.
Wow, that was probably sectional something or other.
No, like go to a different country. Abroad.
When I look at Deadlands and the hucksters and weird scientists and all these things, and then you move over to Deadlands Noir, and they're a bit different. Was it Grifter, and then you got patent scientist instead. Is there going to be some things like that with Dark Ages, where a weird scientist is like an alchemist or something like that? And
you've been reading my notes.
Well, I read
on my computer.
I read
alchemists are the weird science amalgam, or analog would be a better word, in Dark Ages. I'm comfortable revealing that. And that's something that we've worked with a lot, because the Fantasy Companion and the intersections. But one of the things with alchemists are, well, spoilers, if you're going to be a player and you don't want too much dark revealed, in the Weird West and on, you've got a situation where the Reckoners are trying to advance this type of science to reach a certain goal. So they kind of foster weird science. Well, in the Dark Ages, you've got a period where humanity is not, shall we say, really receptive to learning and so forth. So alchemists fulfill kind of the opposite role there, where their main thing is to confuse the situation. And all alchemists have to espouse a certain philosophy on how the universe reacts, like Aristotle and physics, or the four humors, or elemental interactions, just to keep things unclear. So which led to me doing a lot of research into philosophies of how things interacted back then, and some of them are pretty out there. I think my favorite is Aristotelian, which can basically be boiled down to, in some instances, boats float because they're boats, and that's what boats do. They float. So
that works. Yeah. So because of it's Halloween season and you're a master of horror, so what kind of tips would you give people that want to design their own adventure scenario or campaign for, to make it scary, to make it good, the good stuff?
First, if you're doing a campaign, you want the horror at a low level as much as you can. If you start beating them over the head with werewolves jumping out of closets and so forth, it stops being horror and it starts just being action with a different type of work, if you will. I discovered, because I got my introduction to horror through Call of Cthulhu games, the more that you can leave to the player's imagination, the better. And the longer you can do that, the better. Players can have a better idea in their own head subconsciously what scares them. And if you can give them the foundations, they will develop what's frightening in their own heads. Beyond that, I would look to really good horror movies and what works in them. Like I said, the unknown is a huge factor. You have other tropes like isolation, uncertainty, distrust, all of those things you can play in a horror game. You're talking a short game, isolation is a must. The feeling of almost helplessness. I find when you're actually helpless or your character's actually helpless, it stops being horror and it becomes frustration. So you have to have a hook to hang that on, that there is a possibility you can succeed no matter how remote. I don't know, did you ever see the movie Fallen with Denzel Washington, John Goodman, where it's all about a fallen angel. Spoilers if you haven't seen the movie, turn off the sound. When it gets to the end of it, it was very tense up to it. And then it gets to the end and you realize there's really no way you can beat this thing. And it stops being horror and it's just inevitable. Right. And to me, that kind of undercut the whole tension in the movie. So, like Stephen King says, if you can go for terror, go for terror. If you can't get terror, go for horror. If you can't get horror, go for the gross out.
Can you repeat those? I'm going to write those down.
That was too fast.
The hierarchy: terror, horror, gross out. And if you search up that Stephen King quote, I think he even defines what each is for you. So
that's cool.
Taking notes. Horror is not my strong suit, so I was really looking forward to having you on and maybe getting some pointers on how to run a good horror. I've played in a few games that were, I wouldn't say really horror, but you have that feeling that, that sort of suspense, that sort of helplessness and whatnot. But I don't know if I have the ability to bring that to my game as a game master. Usually my games are dumb and comical and they end up just being fart jokes and, so you can imagine how much trouble I have when it comes to trying to bring horror to the table when all I do is just tell stupid jokes all the time.
Yeah, you're not very subtle, Gary.
No.
There is a place for humor in horror. Some of the best bits of horror have humor in them because it kind of breaks the tension, and then it draws you back in by reminding you with the comparison that this is lighthearted, but suddenly you're in over your head, and here's something that you don't know how to deal with, and it's bigger than you ever thought it was going to be. My first introduction to a horror game was a Call of Cthulhu scenario in which we've been playing for like 2 hours, and one of the other players' characters just gets shot and dies. And I had been playing D&D forever, and that didn't happen. And suddenly the guy next to me is dead, and I'm like, what? Like, sorry, I did 20 points to you. What are your hit points? 15. You're dead. And it was that realization that this is not the game I'm used to playing. Yeah. So,
well, that effect, do you have a tip to do it in the game? Because you don't really want to target anybody, but then again, you're known as TPK Goff, so you have no reservations whatsoever.
My convention games, my convention games may end up in TPKs, but I try to make sure everybody gets the full play. I don't like to kill anybody outright at the beginning because I figure you guys paid to be here in some way or form. And I don't want to rip you off from that.
But do you use NPCs instead, or especially
No,
those that have been with the group for a while and that the PCs like, or no?
No, what I found in long-running games, players do become more attached to their characters. They also begin to develop a belief in what their character is capable of handling. And if you can shake that belief, present them with something that is outside the range of what their character is normally exposed to and can normally handle, such as the fighter who suddenly discovers this monster that he just jumped up and was like, all right, I'll just rip this thing apart, and the bullets bounce off of it, or the wounds heal and the thing comes back up, and they start to realize, wait, we're not going to be able to overcome this in the fashion that we thought. Or recurring monsters that you thought you killed, but no, not really. He's back and he's doing exactly what he was doing before. So the skills that you become reliant on are failing you. Things like that. And again, once you lay the seed, I think the players can often run with that mentally and become concerned. But honestly, in a horror campaign, you do have to be willing to kill a character every now and then. And the players have to know that is a possibility. Otherwise, it's not horror. In my opinion.
No, that's all fair. It just that sometimes, well, yeah, it's part of the contract. You got to know what you get yourself into. But sometimes I feel when I put a monster in there that you can't easily just kill, that
Right.
Maybe it's just me, but I feel like the players feel that I'm fudging, or I don't want them to kill my NPCs. Do you have any tricks? Is it in the description?
You lay the groundwork for it beforehand. In a horror game, a big part of it is either investigation or research. Because if you just have them walk into the room with the ghost, they are confronted with something they have no real
tools
network
to defeat.
Frame of mind. They have no real frame of context to place it. It's just a thing in a room. But if you lay the context that the house is haunted or strange things have happened, and as they begin to research it, they get more of a backstory and a feeling that this isn't something that you just go in and stab with a knife. And they know up front you can't beat it in the way that you're used to beating. You've established the contract with the players that goes beyond, I just don't want you to kill my NPCs. It's the foundation is laid for, here is a creature that you can't address in the way that you've always addressed. Does that make sense?
Oh,
Yeah, it's fair. That way, if they do that, then it's their own fault.
Right. It's all in. I'm trying to avoid a phrase that I use way too much with my wife, especially watching movies, the narrative contract, because I'm not fun to watch a lot of movies with, because I sit there and I will analyze like anything that's a mystery. Well, it can't be anyone we haven't met, because that violates the narrative contract that they've laid. So therefore, it has to be someone we've met. And the trope will follow this order. And then at the end, we're going to find out it is this person, because otherwise it violates the structure that this movie will fall into. And I think in a RPG, players begin to expect a certain contract that you're going to operate under. And that's that you're not going to throw a monster at them or a creature or a horror or ghost that they simply can't defeat without at least warning. Now, on the other hand, sometimes you do that. Because
just to scare them. You want them to run away, right?
Right. And to kind of, in a way, establish another contract that you are not in control. In a horror game, you can never feel like you're in control of the situation. The minute you feel you're in control, I think, is when the GM should pull the rug and show you that, no, you didn't actually know everything, or you thought you knew this and it was all a clever trap laid. That's when I think the nervousness sets in, and nervousness can lead to actual horror.
It's pretty interesting, that when I played in the Fighting Ravens with Jamie Pearson, the original creator of the Wild Eye, that was one of the most interesting things for me, was when we were playing these games. It wasn't just, it didn't just boil down to strategy. You've got the little war minis, battle tactics and stuff. These creatures that we were going up against required some actual thought. And it really doesn't matter how you come about figuring out how to overcome these creatures. It's just the idea that that, okay, somebody's going to have to go do some research, and maybe you need to find a baby's toe or something like that, kind of a thing, right? And I think that was one of the most fascinating things about ETU, is in order to overcome these creatures that were real, these whatever Wendigos or little evil spirits and stuff like that. In order to appease them, there was always some trick that you had to do, and you had to research that and figure it out. And I think that was my favorite part about playing ETU, just not having to actually just sit down, roll some dice, and punch a thing in the face. It was like, and it really didn't matter how we resolved it. It was just the idea that we had to think outside the box. I think that was sort of the coolest part for me.
And I think you nailed a big part of it. Once you start rolling the dice in the combat, the horror element kind of slips to the side as everybody becomes focused on the combat. And the research is where you as a GM have a chance to tell the story, actually to present your ghost story or your horror story or so forth, and tell them all these terrible details about the past that lead up to the final confrontation that they're going to have. Ultimately, the final fight might be chancy, people may be afraid their characters are going to die, but a lot of times once you get to the final fight, everyone begins to concentrate on the dice rather than the elements of fear or phobias or whatever you're trying to build on there. So I like to hold off that fight as long as I can.
Yeah, it always seemed to be the last thing that we did.
Yeah. Last year for a horror campaign, I ran one where they spent the whole time as a film crew isolated in this out-of-the-way wilderness area, slowly piecing together what was going on. And by the time they got to the final fight, which honestly they had no chance in because it was my Halloween game and it's a one-shot and I'm going to do my best to kill them all, while giving them that tiny chance that they might win if they get all the clues. And everybody knows that going in. But by the time we got to that final encounter, everybody was so tense that some of the players' characters just ran. They didn't even bother trying to fight. They were just like, I'm running, I'm gone, I'm out of here. So I think that's what you work towards, is laying the groundwork for your final encounter to be so awful that they don't want to have it.
That was good.
Yeah.
You mentioned pacing, with kind of wanting to stretch out, delay the final encounter. One element, at least in movies, is foreshadowing.
Yeah.
How do you work that into your RPG session or campaign to find the right pacing so that players don't feel like they're just, I wouldn't say bored, but like it's just taken too long?
Well, I think that's where you have to be aware of what the capabilities of your characters are, and you make sure that you play to everyone throughout, the course of the game. If you have people that are very good at research, and that's something we tried to do in Deadlands Noir, make the research side of things a little more in depth than just you roll your dice and you find the information. So you want to kind of play to everyone's strengths at some point. Make sure everybody has a chance in the spotlight. There's one I did for, ended up in Explorer, a face by any other name. There's a lot of pounding the pavement, working, talking to people, gathering information, but there's also in the middle of it what I feel is truly an organic fight with just normal opponents that are also involved in the story, that kind of breaks up the like you said, kind of gives the pacing that uptick in beat that keeps the people that have built purely combat oriented characters, keeps them involved in the situation. And then it goes back to building towards the final encounter. And in that final encounter is fairly, if I remember, combat oriented, but I tried to present the opponent in such a way that he's truly horrific. So I don't know if that hits your question.
Well, yeah, to have everybody get their chance in there, and it makes sense.
When I write something for general consumption that may eventually see publication or that I'm going to run at a convention, I do try to make sure that I cover all the bases so that through the course of the adventure, the combat types aren't sitting there until the end. And the research types, who often suffer at the end, have something to do throughout. And I think that's really how you keep it going, is make sure that everyone gets the spotlight in relatively regular intervals. Nobody sits there and waits till the end of the session, or sits there and waits till next session before they really can contribute to what's going on.
So it's a matter of spotlight.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Oh,
go
right.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, while also using that time to build up all of the clues. Like if you do have the combat should tie into the story that you're building. And they should take something from that doesn't necessarily, it sounds like I'm talking about all investigative, but like I said earlier, this is where you're telling your ghost story. And the end of the ghost story is the final conflict. So you've got to make sure that you get the elements in there and they're taking a piece away from every step that they take.
Yeah, with every scene you should be learning something new.
Right.
Just don't throw a combat in there for the sake of combat. It's
right.
To interrogate one guy that's survived the combat, or learn about one of their weaknesses or something like that.
Yeah, and there are some really well-crafted horror movies that give you kind of an idea how that goes. Like The Thing is probably hands down my favorite movie ever. My favorite horror movie, certainly. But Alien. Trying to think of another one that I've watched recently that I really liked, but it's escaping me, and I don't want to take up too much time just naming movies.
Yeah, I think we've been watching the same movies on Shudder. There was one with which what is it, the show with the Exorcist guy, the fake Exorcist guy.
What was that called? That was really good, and I think that was a pretty good example. Of course, it doesn't necessarily work out the way you expect, but there are elements of action and then elements of trying to extract more information, and then action and extracting more information. But the action itself also extracts information. So,
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense.
Do you ever come up with an idea for a monster in your head that you think is super cool, and then maybe like work your way backwards?
all the time.
Okay, cool.
I think half the adventure, the Savage Tales in Dark Ages are written that way. And gosh, what was is it not Grim Prairie Tales, but there was a Deadlands supplement that was another. It was a monster supplement, but each monster had an adventure written to it. That whole book I wrote that way. It's like, oh, this is a neat monster. Now, how does it work in a story? And yeah, that honestly, that's how a whole ton of, I would say the majority of my adventures that are horror-based get written.
That's cool. That gives me some incentive to write my adventure in which the end monster is Eric in his underwear, but he's like the 50-foot tall woman chasing small children through a trailer park, and I just got to figure out how I'm going to get there.
I think it writes itself.
I kind of feel like it does a little bit, right? Thanks, pal.
Wow, so low. But yeah, that's how John minds work. Because I remember posting a picture of like this giant bat that was hanging off someone, and it's like 3 or 4 feet tall. And I'm like, nope. And John says, yeah, you don't see it, but it's holding a child in there inside of its wings. So that's John's mind right there. Awesome.
Nice.
All right. Well, I think we're about done here. We've been going for a little bit over an hour, and I promised some coupons, some prizes. So the first, we've got 16 coupons. So the first 16 to email us, it's the wild eye in one word at gmail.com with the subject line Hollerween. We'll get I'll email you back a coupon. I'll do that tomorrow. So again, the wild eye at gmail.com, and it's been on the ticker going down there if you missed it. Thanks for showing up in great numbers, people. Yeah, cleansing hour. Yeah, that's the one. That was good. So John, amazing tips, amazing information. It was great having you on the show, man.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks, John. It was good.
Yeah.
It was good to pick your brain about some cool horror stuff, because like I say, I feel like I really suck at it, and I'll take all the advice I can get all day long.
I've looked at Stephen King's On Writing. He has a book called On Writing that has a lot of stuff in it that's very helpful.
Cool.
Oh,
Anything you want to plug before you go?
No, we plug Dark Ages pretty hard, and that's consuming my life at the moment. So
good. Should keep consuming you until there's nothing left of you.
Eric wants that so bad.
I think that, honestly, it's now at the point where we're sanding and polishing and filing off edges. So
Nice.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. All right, everybody. Thanks for showing up in great numbers. And we'll see you. Well, we'll have a podcast this weekend coming out next week. And then our next Wild Eye Harder next month as well.
Mm-hmm. What are we talking about this week in the podcast there, Lamoureux?
Attendance for your campaign. How to deal with people not showing up. How to make sure people show up without violence.
Man, I forgot to tell you that I won't be able to make it to this one.
Oh. All right, guys.
All right. Peace out, everybody.
Bye.